Hello everybody, my name is Wesley Hales and I'm going to be doing my presentation on the Tokugawa era of Japan and why I think that is Japan's cultural awakening. First, I wanted to talk about my approach to this topic. I am a history major, so I wanted to first address this, go about doing this project as a historian. So to begin, we'll be talking about the historical context of the Tokugawa period and some of the major changes that occurred in Japanese culture because they were exposed to a lot of new thoughts from the Western world. And at the same time, by appraising Tokugawa-era art, we can see some of these cultural changes visualized. First, we're going to talk about the shogunate. Before the Tokugawa period began, Japan was in a really weird spot called the Sengoku period. Before the Tokugawa took control in 1603, Japan was overwhelmed by a period of warring states, quote-unquote, wherein a bunch of different factions all over the island of Japan were vying for power and battling one another, and it was a chaotic time of warfare. However, Tokugawa Ieyasu eventually took control of the centralized government, and he took control and ruled the country as shogun and not emperor, which was really interesting. While there was an emperor still, so to speak, during this period, the emperor served more as a figurehead rather than the actual head of state. The military actually ran a lot of the country. That is much the same today as with modern English royalty, where the Queen does not have sole power, rather a lot of the power from England comes through its parliament. With his reign, the Sengoku period eventually drew to a close, and Japan entered a new era of peace. Shortly after this, Europeans make landfall in Japan, the first being the Portuguese in 1543. This is actually before the Tokugawa period. But they managed to stay and get some trading rights with Japan, but things eventually went sour with the Portuguese and the Japanese as the Portuguese started taking Japanese as slaves. Shortly after the coming to power of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the Dutch eventually find Japan and were eventually given exclusive trading rights in 1609, being valued much better than the Portuguese that were exploiting the Japanese populace. Here's a quote from Engelbert Kempfer. He was one of the Dutchmen who first came to Japan. He says that the Japanese consider them as the most honest of all the foreigners, being the Dutch, and therefore tolerate them, albeit under close supervision. While they were on the island, for the majority of the time that the Dutch were there, they were under close supervision the entire time. They had a close eye upon them. There was always royal guards around, making sure that they were not up to anything. They were really, really suspicious of these outsiders. Here is a painting of some Japanese people peeking in at the Dutch soon after the trade relations began and things started to get off on the right foot, so to speak, with these new relations. This painting, I believe, was made in the 18th century. Rangaku. So during this time, when the Dutch were undergoing trade relations with Japan, it actually sprung forth a new era of Dutch learning, Rangaku. Between 1643 and 1853, the Japanese had actually gone through and barred the rest of the Western world from trading with them except for the Dutch. During this period, the Japanese learned a lot in the way of science and medicine. The Westerners had made a lot of leeway and a lot of progress in the way of science and had thus shared with the Japanese their findings, and this is a visualization of a really oriental-looking magnifying glass. Here on this next slide is a book of skeletal anatomy. They were actually now starting to see all the different bone structures, how muscles worked and stuff like that, a whole bunch of things related to medicine. Another one of the big things that the Dutch exposed the Japanese to was a new thing called gunpowder and firepower. Compounded with Dutch milling technology, they had windmills and grain mills and the such. Japan started to mass produce gunpowder, flour, sugar, and paper. shortly after the relations with the Dutch started, Japan and the Tokugawa shogunate went forth with a policy called sakoku, meaning chained country. This was their form of isolationism, and with this decree, the Portuguese were officially removed from the island, leaving only the Dutch to trade with Dejima. At Dejima, they were previously trading in Nagasaki. They moved to trade ports to Dejima. They were the only Western forces that they dealt with. The other people that they trade with were the Chinese and the Joseon, the Koreans. Here is a better picture and painting of Dejima at the current time. In this top corner here, you can actually see the Dutch flag being waved, and on the bottom here, you see all of these Japanese trade ships. During this time period, issued forth a new form of poetry emerging out of Japan called haiku. It was a new style of poetry. It is recognized for its format, 17 syllables in total, 3 lines of 5, 7, and 5 syllables. Here on this next slide, I actually have one of my favorites. I looked to see if I could find one that was really nice. The summer grasses, all that remains of a warrior's dreams. This is from Matsuo Basho, and that was the time that he was alive. Here is another interesting painting from the Tokugawa era called Women Airing the Books in Clothes. Airing the books was an annual affair wherein all of the books that people would hold were taken and hung up and aired out to keep out the infestation of both bugs that would eat away at the paper and mildew buildup. An interesting fact about this painting is that at the very bottom of the picture down there, you see a woman who has gotten distracted from her job and is reading an open book. One of the biggest inventions or innovations, I guess you could say, in the Tokugawa era that I was getting looking forward to talking about towards the end of this project was ukiyo-e art. Ukiyo-e was a term, it is a Buddhist term that it's rather pessimistic. It talks about the transitory nature of life, but the Japanese turned it on its head with a homonym meaning to float, ukiyo-e, giving the paintings an air of wonder and love of life and nature. And for the rest of this presentation, I wanted to go through some of my favorite paintings of the Tokugawa era, these being ukiyo-e and also woodblock, which was a style unique to Japan at the time. This painting here, Takayasha the Witch and the Skeleton Spectre, is one of my all-time favorite paintings to come out of Japan. This picture was the wallpaper of my laptop for years back when I was in high school. But the painting has a story, which is really interesting. It talks about the Battle of Kojima, way back in 939 CE. There was a revolt led by a samurai warrior known as Taira no Masakado. His troops were doomed to die fighting the Japanese government in Kyoto. Masakado's cousin, Sadomori, faced him at this battle and killed him, along with the rest of his men being killed there at that battle. Stricken with grief, Masakado's daughter plots to get revenge upon her uncle and takes up witchcraft as the ghosts of the soldiers killed in Kyoto haunt their estate. In the painting, Princess Takayasha holds a scroll. The scroll is to summon a giant, a yokai, called Gashado Kuro, which appears in the form of a giant skeleton created from amalgamated bones of the soldiers who died with Masakado. You can see in the grander picture as it rips away the wall. There are 2 samurai here, one of which is Oyataro Mitsukuni, and the other one is unnamed. But this painting has a twist, and that is, who is the bad guy here? While it looks like the protagonist of this painting is Princess Takayasha, we're actually supposed to root for Mitsukuni, who came here to defeat the witch in the service of the emperor, which I thought was really interesting. Here is another painting that I think is absolutely marvelous, called The Rebellions of the Hogen and Heiji Eras. The Hogen Rebellion occurred in 1156. It broke out in Kyoto over the dispute of imperial succession. The battle itself only went on for a couple of hours. However, there were consequences to this battle that were way more far-reaching than just that day. As the skirmish drew to a close, so did the peaceful Heian period. The rebellion was also responsible for the rise of the new samurai class. One of my favorite aspects of this painting is that it captures completely the chaos of battle. The painting is of way above the clouds, and you're seeing between these partings of the clouds. And while the main focus is in Hogen, the rightmost panel shows the Heiji Rebellion that occurred only 4 years later in 1160. This bird's eye style of the painting gives the viewer a real sense of the chaos that these rebellions encompassed. If you look at various parts of the painting as it occurs over four multiple pieces of wood block, you can see civilians running away. There's carts in the streets. Meanwhile, there's huge clumps of soldiers running through the streets and crowding to get over bridges. It gives the viewer a sense of removal. However, we are able to see everything from where we are. And that draws us to our conclusion. Spanning well over 250 years, Japan's Edo period was a time of peace and prosperity heretofore unseen. And while the era ended in an economic struggle, Japan's culture flourished during this period, and Japanese culture saw many changes molding the identity of Japan that we romanticize today. Thank you all. It has been a pleasure doing this project, and these last few slides are just some resources that I used for this presentation. Thank you.